bit about my story. I think I'm Nigerian, and I preface that by saying opportunities. I didn't think that there were opportunities for me like there were for Americans. And so my journey started in 2015 when I came to the US on a 2-week summer vacation and had a crisis on the flight from Amsterdam to Seattle. And at the time, I thought it was another vaso-occlusive crisis. I would be admitted, top 7 to 10 days. I'd be discharged and I'd be on my merry way. And unfortunately, I was diagnosed with a bacterial infection that the doctors had estimated, I was touch and go for 6 months. And I think for me at that time, that was where the worry and the desperation hit, because I think as a sickle cell warrior, sickle cell is a blessing in that it makes you incredibly resilient. And that's why we have the title warrior. But sickle cell also robs you of some goals, some dreams. And so for me, if someone had told me in 2015 that my life would come to a screeching halt, I would have argued and said, you have no idea what you're talking about. But that was my case. But the interesting thing about my condition was I had something called, for the providers on this live, it's called Mycobacterium avium complex. And I had to be on a series of antibiotics, 5 in particular, over the course of 24 months. That's how long it takes to fully clear this infection. Mine started in my liver, and then it moved to my lungs and my kidneys, and then my entire bloodstream. And so it was really grueling time. But what that did was it then made me eligible for a clinical trial. But in my case, my doctors in Seattle never mentioned to me the option of a curative therapy. But I, as an individual, kind of felt, okay, I didn't want my life to end abruptly. And I knew that if I was going to go out, I was going to go out without a fight. And so I started doing research on my own, of course, stumbled upon the NIH's website. And then I decided, all right, well, how do I start a conversation with them? And at the time, an organization called Bold Lips for Sickle Cell, they were doing some work with the National Institutes of Health. And so I was introduced to my dear mentor, Vince Bonham, who's the acting deputy director of the National Human Genome Research Institute. And then he put me in touch with Dr. Matthew Shea, who is a provider and researcher at the NHLBI. And so that's kind of how my curative therapy discussion started. It happened because I had the self-agency to be able to say, I didn't want to go out without a fight. I wanted to do everything I can to explore what options are available to me, because disease-modifying therapies like hydroxyurea, I had been on it for 12 years, and I hadn't really seen great results in ways that I've seen other patients benefit from what is the standard of care treatment. And so that's kind of how I embarked on my curative therapy journey 4.5 years ago. And that's what brought me here today. Now, although I do share some of the challenges I'm still encountering as I navigate life post curative therapy, my answer is always this: I would do it again. I would do it in a heartbeat, because one of the reasons why I embarked on that journey was I wanted a better quality of life. I wanted to be able to make plans and see them through. I wanted to be able to have dreams and have goals for myself, and be able to have the strength and the energy to embark on those unique journeys. And so I am grateful. I always come from a place of gratitude. And to be honest with you, I actually think my transformative therapy was a blessing to me, because it has introduced me to people that I probably may have never known if I didn't embark on that journey. My relationship with Jimi, my relationship with Christelle, and many others who have either participated in transplantation or gene therapy was birthed from a curiosity of trying to find other warriors like me. Because oftentimes within the sickle cell space, we are focused on research on how to navigate this disease and developing other disease modifying therapies, because there is no one size fits all approach for a sickle cell warrior. Hence why, we have the birth of Endari, Adakveo, Oxbryta, and the additional supportive therapies as well. But I say all that to say that being on this journey on the other side has been really eye-opening. It's forced me to learn about my body in a way that I never knew before, because I say like sickle cell is like a cyclone, right? You are caught in the middle of it, and oftentimes your day to day is determined by your disease. And so now that I've been able to kind of lower the burden of my own personal challenges with sickle cell disease, I'm in a better position to be able to get my hands into advocacy. But as Christelle mentioned, I'm launching a podcast this month in 18 days on World Sickle Cell Day called Through the Genes. And this podcast was created because there was a need. Many patients who are embarking on the curative therapy journey, especially with the announcement of the FDA approvals in December last year, are curious about what is the experience of gene therapy. Oftentimes, the media captures these stories, but there are certain aspects of the story that isn't well spoken about. And so I wanted to create a platform where patients and providers could come and we can ask them as many questions, just again, because the goal was always to educate the community on the risks, benefits, and the limitations of these cell and gene-based therapies. And so on June 19th, along with my sickle sister, Dima Hendricks, we are launching Through the Genes podcast on all streaming platforms. We are also going to have the live video versions of our interviews on YouTube as well. And I really hope that we created this for the community, by the community. Oftentimes in these conversations, patients' care is being discussed and we are left out of those conversations. And so I felt like we as patients needed to create something for us, by us, because researchers and clinicians and scientists, they know the science behind these therapies, but we know the lived experience. And I think that speaks volumes, because we are the ones that have navigated this disease our whole life and are doing our best to get to the other side of a transformative therapy. And so I'm really hoping that this podcast serves as a blueprint for conversations to come, whether that be in spaces with providers or with the general public. I really want this to serve as a way, as your one-stop shop when it comes to patient educational materials. And so we have 6 episodes. We touch on everything from mental health to comparing transplant versus gene therapy for patients who are like, well, I recognize that gene therapy, you don't need a match, but transplantation is also something I'm curious about. We do a side-by-side comparison. Jimi was a phenomenal guest on our show. And we also had a brilliant opportunity to interview his wife, because in these types of conversation, oftentimes the patient is the focal point and we leave out the caregiver voice. And I will speak for myself and say, I am absolutely nothing without the support of my mom, who has sacrificed her entire career so I am the woman I am today. And so his wife did a fantastic job of offering the caregiver perspective, because, oftentimes we're living it, but then our loved ones have a bird's eye view of how the disease is really impacting our life and seeing the transformation in our quality of life today. And so I'm hoping you guys will share it, listen to it, support it in any way that you can, because again, we're hoping that this is just scratching the surface. As I'm sure you've listened to every panelist here who's given a presentation, there are so many layers to these novel therapies. And so we're only peeking at the surface. And I'm hoping that, we'll have a season 2 and a season 3 to be able to delve into a lot more conversations about transformative therapies. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to put it in the chat and we can take that. But that's a little spiel from me.
More than just a little spiel. Wow, just thank you. Just so good to hear your perspective and how you've used your experience and channeled it into something that will actually benefit so many more warriors for generations to come. It's a podcast. It's going to stay, it's evergreen, right? As the social media folks call it. But really, no, it has so much value. And I just thank you for creating that, because that is something I wish I had in my process of trying to figure out, what am I going to consider? What are my options? And having a place where I can actually trust the information. They're from experts who are vetted by sickle cell warriors. Like, I'm
Mhm.
just so excited. And I just want to take a moment to encourage any researchers or providers on the call. Like, this is exactly why we have this, like, bridging the gap is so important for actually creating the change that you want to see and that we will benefit from. And so if you have the time, listen to it while you're walking, listen to it while you're cooking. I think it'll really be so eye-opening, because it's eye-opening for me, and I'm a sickle cell warrior and I know what it's like to have sickle cell, but being able to delve into some of the details that don't get taught to you in your textbooks, I think is so important. And warriors, definitely tune in. I think sometimes it can be hard to find this information online, and you're putting together something you saw in an article here and something you saw in an article there. And how do you compare the two? Definitely tune in, because I think this will be very educational and informative for you and your families as you embark on these decisions.
Yeah, I was gonna really quickly, I wanted to mention this to warriors.
Yeah.
So on the podcast, the reason why we chose to co-host is because we wanted to offer two unique perspectives. Dima is a patient, a sickle cell warrior who embarked on the curative therapy journey, but had to be removed from the protocol because she developed a blood clot in her heart. And so she has very strong opinions about transformative therapies. And so we wanted to really cover this conversation from two different perspectives, because we know not all warriors will be willing or able to participate in transformative therapies. We're talking about costs, but we're also talking about access. There will be some states that don't have, vetted treatment centers to be able to execute gene therapy. And so you might have to commute to a different state to participate in that transformative therapy. Or you may be older and be in your 40s and be a golden warrior. And, for you, you're like, there are too many risks. I'd rather just continue on the path I'm on of holistic treatment and disease modifying therapies. And so when we created this, we didn't want it to we wanted it to be an unbiased point of view. Oftentimes, when you involve pharma, you are swayed in one direction or another. And we wanted this to be exactly created for patients by patients. And so I really encourage you to give it a listen when it's out, because I think you'll see that even though we have two perspectives on the same topic, these created for more invigorating and informative conversations.
Yeah, I've got nothing else to add to that. If that wasn't enough to convince you to watch it or listen to it, I don't know what else will. So thank you both so much for joining and sharing your experience. I'm gonna invite everyone to turn on their cameras and join us for the Q&A session that we have here. I have some questions that are in the chat, in the Q&A box, and we can go through them. There are some that are already answered by text via chat, but we can also go through that just so that everyone gets the information. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our first question that's in the chat box by Aaliyah Romero. And it says, were there any specific characteristics that increase the odds of patients developing leukemia, or does it appear to be a random occurrence? I'm assuming this is directed to Dr. Walter, so I'll let you go ahead and speak.
Yeah, I can try to answer that question, but I also want to, before I forget, Wunmi, Jimmy, Christelle, I want to say, and I regret having taken so long in my career to do this, but I'm really excited about the work you're doing and the way you communicate to the community and warriors, and now, I mean, you guys are pioneers about your experience, because you're just going to be much more effective than someone like I am about explaining what it is to go through the treatment. So and it just feels like a wave of partnership has developed. So this is a partnership with the community that I regret not doing this years and years ago, but it is really I predict it's going to be effective. And like when those first two patients developed leukemia on the gene therapy clinical trial, Dr. Janet Rowley from Cayenne contacted me, Adrian Shapiro. We jumped on a town hall right away, because now we can report our experience real time, and so that And when I meet with anyone in that 15-year long-term follow-up period, that's my opportunity to give them an update about, here are the results of the clinical trial. This is what's happened to the treatment. These are the side effects that have been reported. And so you get the feedback. So I just, before I answer the question, I just wanted because this is the way we should be doing things. And I'm really glad that you've engaged me to give me a chance to do this, because it's just going to go so much better together. So yeah, the answer is that we're still pretty limited in how we can predict if a person is likely to get a cancer after they go through the treatment. The DNA sequencing technology allows us to screen for certain changes that we already know about in the DNA that could lead to leukemia. And so in our clinical trial, and and I believe all the other clinical trials, we do a screening. And if a person has one of these changes in their blood cell DNA that could portend a risk of future risk of leukemia, we can't include them in the clinical trial. I think it would be too risky. But honestly, I don't think we have the right tools right now. I don't think we're very good at predicting the risk. So we're pretty blind still. It's going to get better as we understand it better, but we're in the very early learning stages, I'm sorry to say.
Sometimes I don't know is the best answer, if that's what it is, or we don't know yet. So thank you for that. I have another question that's slightly, it's around the same vein. You let me know if it's exactly the same question, Dr. Walters. It's also about transfer leukemia outcome with the bone marrow transplant itself, whether or not that's possible. And is the frequency of this side effect different than with gene therapy? So kind of comparing gene therapy to transplant with leukemia risk.
Yeah, it's a good question. It kind of depends on how the transplant is done. So the conventional way we do a bone marrow transplant using a brother or sister's donor it has been to use very high dose chemotherapy that basically eliminates all of the host, the person receiving the transplant, all of their blood cells. So so the risk of leukemia when we do a transplant that way is very low. But when we then develop ways to do a transplant in adults, like the way they're doing it done at the NIH, particularly if there's a mismatched donor, as it turns out, there are a lot of residual hosts, that is, sickle producing cells that survive and have been exposed to radiation, and it's in that background that the risk of leukemia appears to be higher. So we think the leukemia is coming from the sickle cell disease person's blood cells that through the transplant have either been altered or amplified in a way that leads to leukemia. And so the gene therapy is a little bit like that, because we don't use the same, we use 3 drugs, let's say, in a bone marrow transplant. We just use 1 drug. So there are it's more likely that some of the host, the person receiving the gene therapy, some of their cells will survive it and be exposed to the chemotherapy. And that's our thinking about that. So probably lower risk in a bone marrow transplant when you use full dose chemotherapy. Certainly higher risk if you receive a minimal amount of chemotherapy in preparation for the transplant. And then we're still learning about gene therapy. I don't know if that made any sense. Sorry if it doesn't.
You can always add a follow-up question in the chat or in the Q&A box. Oh, that was a very thorough answer. Thank you for that. I'm going to keep on going. So I think you already answered this in the chat, Nikki and Erica, but someone, Miriam Romero, asked about how can a warrior join the program? How long has it been in place? And so if you could just say it out loud so that everyone can get a chance to hear, that'd be great.
Yes, so our sickle cell program started in 2022. We have a hub and spoke model. So Boyer is our hub, which is in Westwood, adjacent to Ronald Reagan. And then our spokes are in downtown LA, Santa Clarita, and Redondo Beach. So we have our hematologists, which are Dr. Steele and Dr. Schiller. And then we have sickle cell physician champions who have done extra training in sickle cell, so they're familiar. And they're in charge of all the primary care aspect, and then they're followed in our heme hub. So how you would essentially get more information about the program, or we'd be able to put you in, is I put the email there. It's Boyer, BOWYERSCD pool@mednet.ucla.edu. So if you just send your information over and requesting that you'd like to be part of our sickle cell program, we'd connect you with our primary care team and schedule you an appointment with our hematologist.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to the next question just so we get through everything. I see. So Adrian Shapiro, we love to see you here. What is the longest time someone has been followed by post gene therapy, vector and CRISPR? Am I interpreting it correctly? So what's the longest time someone's been followed after gene therapy? Both kinds.
Yeah, the sickle cell disease trial by Bluebird Bio, I think started in 2015, 2016. So that's 8-9 years ago. That was that first group of 7, and CRISPR started later. So I'm not sure they have much more than 4 or 5 years follow-up. So we have very limited long-term follow-up, and that's the challenge, is that we're still learning about what the long-term effects might be.
Thank you. And another question from Adrian. Oh no, this was a statement, but I'm just going to read it out loud. There are CBOs that offer services to warriors and their families. I'm assuming this was related to gene therapy, the whole process. So just know that there are resources available. Instagram is a great place to find all of the CBOs listed, but there are also the Sickle Cell Consortium. There are different websites where you can access a list of CBOs. And if you know another warrior, they probably know another CBO. So feel free to reach out to your network to get connected. And Adrian here on the call is also a great resource. So I'm going to go ahead. Eliminate that. Okay, I've got another question. It says, in addition to GVHD, what are other risks of a bone marrow transplant, and what are the long-term effects?
Yeah, so the graft versus host disease is the most important one, because it can become a chronic illness, and there are many complications related to the treatment. So unfortunately, the avascular necrosis of the hip and the shoulder that a sickle cell disease person is prone to get can also be promoted by some of the treatment, since we use corticosteroids to control graft versus host disease. So lots of side effects from the medicines to control the immune system, in addition to infections that one would be more susceptible to get. And then the chemotherapy itself, we've touched on many of them today. I think infertility is one of the most important ones, and not just infertility and after puberty in women. There's also not the ovaries, in addition to not having any viable eggs anymore, also don't produce enough estrogen, and estrogen is important for bone health and other aspects of health. So having to go on hormonal replacement is another important aspect. And I could go on, and I do when I meet with families. But yeah, bone marrow transplant has some of the same, and then some unique complications as gene therapy.
Okay, so I have another question. Well, actually, let me step back. So remember the question I asked from Adrian about what's the longest long-term follow-up you've given for a patient, or that is present for a patient who has undergone gene therapy. She actually wanted to know if there are other disease groups with patients that have received gene therapy, and how long that they've been followed for, if you happen to know that.
Yeah, the first report of gene therapy for thalassemia, I think it was in 2010. So that's 14 years. And then Don Cohen at UCLA, who's a professor, pediatrics there, bone marrow transplant specialist, has performed gene therapy for inherited disorders of the immune system, so-called bubble boy disease. And I believe he first treated patients about the same time, or maybe even a little bit earlier. So that's still, 15 years follow-up. That's pushing my knowledge bubble. That's what I know, Adrian.
We have one more question related to chemotherapy and radiation. And this person asks, can you speak to concerns about the impact of chemotherapy and or radiation on brain development for children under the age of 3, considering bone marrow transplant?
Yeah, so that's great too. There are some hereditary disorders where you have to intervene in some cases in the first several weeks of life. And so that's where a lot of our information comes from. And when you give full dose chemotherapy to those babies, there are brain effects. And so that's why the dose has been modified. Also, the busulfan, which is the drug we use in the gene therapy clinical trials, that's particularly dangerous in very young children. So you have to modify the dose and monitor the levels very carefully. So I tend not, this has evolved over the years, but I'm not sure, unless there is some extenuating circumstance, that we should be treating children less than 4 or 5 years of age for these reasons, if we can avoid it.
Yeah, I do. Dr. Walters, I wanted to ask, if a patient participates in a transplant, but the transplant doesn't take, as in their chimerism level drops and it's obvious that the sickle cell is going to return, can they be transplanted again? And if yes, how long do you have to wait before you can try it again?
Yeah, so that's a complication we call graft failure or graft rejection. And sometimes it happens quite quickly after the transplant, and it's accompanied by not having a functional blood system. So when that happens, I do the second transplant right away, and it's a little bit easier than waiting, just because their bone marrow is already empty. They don't have any. So then we just suppress the immune system, and we can either use the same donor, or if there's another one available, I generally try to use a different donor, and then that has worked in our hands pretty reliably. I'm happy to say. What's harder is when, and this happens more commonly, is that it happens much later. The blood system is recovered, and then it's just a rejection of the donor blood system, and then the sickle cell disease comes back, and then you really have to do a full second transplant. And that approach I've been more reluctant to do, because it's just harder to do after you've already had one transplant to do a second one.
Another question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Is there a reason why people who have participated in transplantation or gene therapy, why are we not allowed to donate? Or either donate marrow or donate blood? No, donate stem cells or donate blood.
The blood is easier because so, for example, with Lifegenia, there's a range of blood cells. Some of them still have quite a lot of sickle hemoglobin in them, and so you wouldn't want to use those in a situation where you want to give a full effect of hemoglobin and red blood cells that are functional to a person who needs a blood transfusion. So that's easy enough to answer. The whether to use I haven't considered this, using as your bone marrow as a donor. It's an interesting question. I guess it's because you still have the immunological, you still have to do the matching of the transplant genes. But then the question is, will those stem cells be as potent as if you were a healthy donor? And probably not. And then there's this added question of, would there be a risk of getting a leukemia later in life because of the gene therapy treatment? Because we haven't completely answered that question. So I think that's the answer why we wouldn't we would disqualify someone who'd had a gene therapy treatment as being a stem cell donor. But I honestly, I haven't really thought of that before you asked it right now. So I need to think longer about the answer.
I do have one question that was answered, but I think it would be great if you talked about it out loud, Dr. Walters. So it says, what about preserving male fertility? Are there solutions for preserving male fertility to those who have a bone marrow transplant prior to puberty? And then I think they really want to enhance their understanding about sperm that is that they do not develop sperm yet. What are the options in that instance? So basically before puberty, how does...
Yeah, so and we do the same thing for boys and girls. And right now this is experimental, but I suspect very soon it won't be any longer. So you can extract a wedge of either the testis or the ovary and freeze it. And then my understanding is that then the surgeon, when you're ready to have your family, can sew back that fragment into the ovary or the testis, and there's a good probability that it will start to function again. And then and so that's my understanding of how that works. I'm not an expert in it, and it's an evolving technology, but we do have a research project, and so all of the children of families who want to pursue this is the option we give them.
And Nikki, you had answered in the chat that males would collect sperm to cryopreserve at a sperm bank. Do you want to talk about how you guys handle that at UCLA?
Sure. We partner with a company, the California Cryobank. There's another company we partner with now, and basically there's just a sample box, and a lot of times these people are in the hospital if they're collecting, or in the clinic, or they can take it home and they ship it. And usually if the social work or if there's any financial issues, social work is involved to get funding and discuss that with the patient. And then as far as the egg, preservation, we have a team in gynecology that sees our patients and focuses on that.
If anyone I want to be able to tap into someone who's not able to chat right now. If you're tuning in and you have a question and you don't have a hand to type, feel free to, I'll put my email address in the chat. I'll put my email address and make it available on social media through @UCSF Sickle Cell. And you can send in your questions at that point. So let me go ahead. Did anyone else on the panel have any other questions or any thoughts they wanted to leave us with?
I think last minute thoughts are just, I hope that we can find a home for warriors on the other side of curative therapies, because our journey still continues on. And so, well, let me articulate that now. I think my mission going forward is to find a home for warriors on the other side, because we still identify as warriors, but now we just have a little bit more energy to do the grassroots work of what it takes to continue to grow this community. And so I'm hoping that for those who are aspiring transformative therapy participants, that that you have a home with those of us who have been on this journey to guide you through what you're about to experience and your life on the other side.
Yes, thank you. Oh, wow. Okay, there are now multiple questions. I see Dr. Walters, you're already answering one. Do you want to just unmute and answer that?
The first one is the criteria who gets gene therapy for the clinical trials. It's having 2 or more serious painful episodes per year in the 2 years before enrollment. The labels for the FDA approved gene therapy, gene editing is more vague. It's just experiencing significant sickle cell disease complications. So so it's a little bit broader for the approved treatments. Other places that offer gene therapy in California. So for for my clinical trial, that will be at UCLA and UCSF. I believe the licensed, I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of this. You can really check the websites for Casgevy and Lyfgenia, but I'm pretty certain Stanford, Children's Hospital Los Angeles, I believe UC Irvine, UCLA, and probably a few others that I'm missing. But the best source of that are the websites for the licensed therapies.
Yeah. So we're contracted with Bluebird. That we've already screened our first patient. We have 3 actually that are in the screening process for insurance, and then Casgevy is we're doing this combined contract. The last I heard with UCSF, there was some compliance people that were taking over in regards to that one.
Oh, that's interesting. Didn't know that. University, wow, what a concept. The University of California working together.
I want to circle back. I got a follow-up question in the chat about, I think this is referring to the criteria to who is eligible for gene therapy. And the question is, do they include vaso-occlusive crises that are treated at home also?
In the clinical trials, it needs to be required hospitalization. I believe it was like past 24 hours. And then, or like an infusion. What we put for the patient that we're currently running through, she's had inpatient stay and then like management in our outpatient infusion center as well for VOEs.
But yeah, for the licensed products, I haven't had any experiences where a payer is specifying where they have their pain. And personally, I view the ones treated at home and the ones treated in the hospital as equivalent, because there's been some research showing that if you look at for example, markers of inflammation in the blood and compare a painful event treated at home and in the hospital, they have the same inflammation markers. So it's the same thing. It's just that a lot of people have learned, sadly, that they can treat their pain better at home than it gets treated in the hospital or the emergency department, which is that health disparity issue that we've touched on today. It's really a problem.
Yeah, there are so many warriors who are like, I'll just stay home and take care of myself at home. So I'm glad that that was actually a really big question I had in terms of qualifying for the transplant and looking at eligibility criteria, because I had forced myself not to go to the hospital because I didn't want to expose myself to any more trauma. I'm like, I'm already hurting. I might as well just hurt at home than hurt somewhere else where someone's going to accuse me and I have to be cold in AC air-conditioned hospital. So I'm really glad that, I hope that will shift to all clinical trials as well, because I think that is really important to widening the accessibility for these therapies. And then I have one last question. I'm going to wrap it up after this. Are insurances requiring specific clinical characteristics to qualify for gene therapy coverage? I know we touched on it. I don't know if I missed this answer, but if someone could just follow up really quickly.
So we don't know how it's going to go with Medi-Cal. That's been our #1 question. Since they're still reviewing their guidelines, it's up in the air what will actually be covered in that aspect. I know that they're running a commercial insurance patient through. That's the one who I was referring to. They wanted proof that all other therapies were tried first, so all disease modifying agents prior to gene therapy, and they wanted proof of like multiple inpatient stays was what they asked for, and all the documentation to support how many times this patient has come into our infusion center within the last 24 months, and how many times this patient has been inpatient. And they wanted to know transfusion history. It was a long letter that I sent over yesterday in regards to this one patient. Yes. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a little disheartening to hear. I'm glad you shared that, because I feel like that's a whole side we don't get to see. And when we ask pharmaceutical companies, it's like, I don't know, ask your provider. But yeah, that gives us a little bit of insight. Yeah, I have more questions for the people who made the rules than for you. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm gonna go ahead and start to wrap us up since we have 5 minutes to go, and I don't want us to go over time. Oh gosh, sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Can I ask one more question? I think it's just so important to make sure people leave with their questions answered. Last one. Can you talk about the preparation and recovery process for bone marrow transplant and for children and the estimated timeline?
It's kind of similar to the gene therapy, so except that obviously we don't have to collect stem cells from the person getting the treatment. We will collect them from the donor, but we do an assessment for their fitness, their health, to get through the procedure safely, and that takes a few weeks, and then generally it takes a week of chemotherapy before the bone marrow transplant. We have to make arrangements for a surgeon to put in a central venous catheter to facilitate the treatment, and then generally 4 to 6 weeks recovery in the hospital, and then a full 3 months after the transplant, clinic visits and follow up until we're ready to see them less frequently. After a bone marrow transplant, it takes generally about a year for the immune system to recover fully. So there's still some visits and some precautions that we ask folks to follow in the home. And it's a quick answer.
Awesome. Thank you for wrapping it up briefly, knowing that we only have a few minutes left. I want to go back to what Wumi said about creating a safe space for people on the other side. It is so important, and I'm very grateful that you're spearheading the creation of that space. And I hope today, like from this town hall, that you were able to like whet your palate about and gain an appetite for all the different areas to be looking into, to be asking questions about, to be researching on your own, to be asking your patients about their experiences or things to consider as you make plans creating another therapeutic option. I wanted to have all these people speak to be able to give a broad overview on we're just literally just scratching the surface of all the things that we could be addressing and talking more deeply about when it comes to gene therapy in sickle cell disease. And the key takeaways, there's so much there's the potential for immense benefit for gene therapy and transplantation and other transformative therapy options, but there is also so much to consider. And so as we move forward and continue to do these town halls, we want to hear from you about what is it that you still have on your mind? What is it that you are hesitant about? What is it that you've heard that you want to ask questions about? We want to be able to reach the warriors and the families where they're at and bridge the gap and have them in a space with experts and people who are invested in their well-being and actually want to listen and hear their stories. And so we're welcome to feedback. We have a link in the chat that will allow you to share with us what you felt about the town hall. Was it helpful? What wasn't helpful? What do you wish you saw more of? We're open to feedback because we're here to serve the community. And so feel free to let us know how we can improve moving forward. And I hope you walked away with some valuable nuggets from today. And I just thank you for joining us, because I just feel like sickle cell has, and this is not a feeling, this is truth, sickle cell has been neglected. The sickle cell warriors have been neglected for so long. And so to be able to have a space where the people on this call care about warriors, they care about not just curing a disease, but improving the overall wellness of their whole being. And so I just thank you for joining us on a Saturday, for taking time out of your day. I thank the panelists for coming and just blessing us with information and also being so honest and sharing their experiences. And I cannot thank each and every one of you enough for being here. And I look forward to having you back, if you don't mind me calling you again. So yeah, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.